This is going to shock you, but Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Lisa Jackson is right. We face a severe climate change crisis and serious threats to human health, welfare, and justice. How we respond will determine the future of our country, the welfare of America's families and children, and whether the third world's poorest families will ever be able to take their rightful places among the Earth's healthy and prosperous people. This unprecedented environmental and moral crisis is partly related to carbon dioxide emissions and partly a function of energy use and pollution issues of other kinds. However, the crisis is not due to factory or power plant emissions. It's not due to melting glaciers and ice caps or rising seas or storms and droughts or human health problems that some say may result from emissions from power plants and factories. Instead, the real crisis we face is the result of laws, policies, and regulations implemented and imposed in the name of preventing climate change and other hypothetical or hugely exaggerated environmental problems. The EPA and IPCC claim their actions will prevent catastrophes that dangerous pollutants and global warming will otherwise inflict on mankind. In reality, the emerging catastrophes are due to policies and regulations that the EPA, the IPCC, and other government agencies are inflicting on America and the world. Some of the most serious of these threats come from EPA's proposed endangerment rules for CO2, but there are many others. Congress rejected cap, tax, and trade. The world has turned its back on Kyoto, and developing nations are rightly refusing to sacrifice their economic growth and poverty eradication on the altar of climate change alarmism. So, President Obama and Administrator Jackson found another way to skin the cat, as they put it. By directly and indirectly hyper-regulating carbon dioxide, they set out to control energy use and economic activities throughout the United States, forced dozens of coal-fired power plants to shut down years before their productive life was over, and block the construction of any new coal-fired power plants that could meet the impossible target of emitting no more than 1,000 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour of electricity generation. They also intend to control CO2 emissions from numerous other sources, including cars, shopping malls, and factories. EPA has also issued new regulatory edicts covering mercury and air toxic soot, cross-state air pollution from sources hundreds of miles away, and dozens of other supposed air and water pollution problems. These rules are really nothing more than backdoor ways of regulating and closing power plants and other sources of CO2. EPA has also issued 600 pages of new rules for hydraulic fracturing that's needed to produce natural gas to fuel replacements for coal-fired power plants that the agency is closing down and backup generators for wind and solar installations that our governments are mandating and subsidizing. All these actions reflect President Obama's campaign promise to bankrupt any company that tries to build a new coal-fired power plant, replace hydrocarbons with expensive wind, solar, and biofuels, and make energy prices necessarily skyrocket, while fundamentally transforming America's constitutional, legal, economic, energy, and social structures. Ms. Jackson insists that EPA's carbon dioxide and pollution rules will improve human health and welfare while ensuring environmental justice for the minority and other poor families in our country. However, the climate change and other catastrophes relied on by EPA to justify its economy-strangling regulations exist only in computer models, fertile imaginations, student and activist papers, and headline-grabbing news releases. The real world is simply not following the IPC or EPA script. The anti-hydrocarbon, anti-development solutions they propose will bring no real-world benefits, even assuming their carbon dioxide hypothesis is correct. And that's partly because China and India and other developing countries and even Japan and Germany are increasing their use of coal for electricity generation, and thus their emissions of CO2 far beyond anything America can reduce. The health, welfare, and environmental justice benefits that they claim will result from these regulations are likewise wildly exaggerated and illusory. They exist only in the same computer-generated virtual reality that concocted the seemingly endless stream of climate change cataclysms. It's no wonder, really, that EPA has refused to consider studies that the NIPCC reports and papers being presented here cover, engage or debate scientists and other experts like those at this conference, or even reassess its reliance on the IPCC claims and conclusions in light of things like ClimateGate and FakeGate and Donna LaFramboise' book, The Delinquent Teenager, or even admissions by IPCC itself that its loud pronouncements about temperatures, glaciers, and sea levels were somewhat off the mark. Most damning of all, it is completely impossible to implement EPA's regulatory agenda without inflicting severe economic dislocations that will send shockwaves through America's factories, farmlands, and families. Far from improving our health and welfare, they will make our economy, unemployment, living standards, health and welfare even worse. Far from ensuring environmental justice, they will make the pursuit of justice and happiness much more difficult for poor, minority, and blue-collar families in America, and even more so in the third world. It will be all pain for no gain. It doesn't take a PhD to appreciate how EPA's carbon dioxide and related rules will severely impact electricity generation and prices and reliability, factory, office, and hospital operations and budgets, the competitiveness of American industry in the fast-paced global environment, employment, hiring, and layoffs, and the well-being of families and entire communities, especially those that rely on mining or manufacturing. However, EPA has steadfastly refused to consider the economic costs of its regulations or even their inevitable adverse consequences on people's jobs, living standards, health, and welfare. Energy, as we all know, is the lifeblood of our nation's economy, jobs, living standards, and civil rights progress. Anything that affects energy availability, reliability, and price affects every aspect of our lives. A recent White House letter acknowledged that EPA alone is still working on new regulations that the agency calculates will impose $105 billion in additional regulatory burdens and compliance costs. This is an enormous tax imposed on top of the regulations that EPA issued during its first 3 years in power under the Obama administration. And somebody, all of us, will have to pay these costs. Energy analyst Roger Bezdek says utilities will have to spend $130 billion to retrofit or replace coal-fired units, and another $30 billion per year for operations, maintenance, and the extra fuel that these energy-intensive scrubbers and other equipment will require after they're installed to generate increasingly expensive electricity. The costs will reverberate throughout our economy. Millions could be laid off, millions more won't be hired or rehired, millions more will endure brownouts and blackouts as the regional grids increasingly strain under all this weight during periods of peak demand. Duke Energy's $3 billion coal gasification and carbon capture and storage power plant will increase rates for Indiana customers by some 15% over the next 2 years. For a hospital, factory, shopping mall, or school district that has $1 million annual electricity bill, that's an extra $150,000 per year in operating expenses. It's 4 or 5 entry-level jobs. Money spent to hire regulatory lawyers and compliance officers, retrofit power plants or tear them down, and build new ones, and pay 15, 20, or even 40% more for electricity is money that's not available to create or preserve productive jobs or advance real-world health, welfare, and environmental justice. EPA nonetheless remains fixated on slashing CO2 emissions by some 80% below 1990 levels. The last time the United States had CO2 emissions that low was just after the Civil War. Today, coal generates 45% of America's electricity, 48 to 98% of the electricity in 26 states. Electricity rates in states with the most coal-based power are 6 to 9 cents per kilowatt hour. Compare that to 13 or 17 cents per kilowatt hour in states that have the least coal use and the most strict renewable energy standards or the whopping 40 cents a kilowatt hour they pay in Denmark. These low electricity rates are a huge advantage for manufacturers, offices, hospitals, schools, and families, and high rates can be devastating. In Britain, since 2004, the cost of household energy has risen 7 times faster than household incomes. Some 12 million people are already in fuel poverty, unable to pay for wintertime heating because of government-imposed CO2 standards and renewable energy requirements. EPA's rules are poised to do the same thing here in America, and I think win or lose in November, the administration is ready to impose a raft of new rules. Meanwhile, utility companies are already planning to close down numerous coal-fired generating units representing tens of thousands of megawatts, enough to electrify tens of millions of homes and small businesses. The Chicago Tribune says Illinois alone could lose 3,500 megawatts over the next couple of years. And Illinois businesses and families could be paying 20 to 50% more for electricity. Chicago public schools alone could have to pay $2.7 million more per year for their electricity. Family budgets would have to stretch even further to pay for food, fix the car, repair the roof, keep people comfortable and alive on frigid winter nights and sweltering summer afternoons. Every one of these energy and economic impacts clearly affects people's health and welfare. It affects our unemployment rates. Right now, the rate officially is 8.1%, but 342,000 more people gave up looking for jobs just this past month. So you factor in all these things, all of them are directly related to the energy prices that we pay and our reliability and access to energy. However, as bad as all this is, life under the climate change prevention agenda is infinitely worse for the world's most impoverished people. Nearly 90% of sub-Saharan Africa's 800 million people still do not have electricity, or they have it only a few hours a week. Al Gore uses more electricity in a week than 28 million Ugandans together use in a year. Think about that. No electricity means 700 million Africans don't have refrigerators to preserve food, and they're forced to cut down trees, habitats, and burn wood and animal dung to cook. Outside of big cities, people simply don't have access to electricity for those things, for air conditioning, for water purification, sanitation, or for businesses that create real jobs. Situation is a similar one, less extreme perhaps in other poor countries, but as a result, 1.4 million people die every year from lung infections and another million almost from intestinal diseases that result from the lack of electricity. And yet the EPA and White House refuse to support the construction of a coal-fired generating plant in South Africa and a gas-fired power plant in Ghana because of their fears about global warming. The IPCC's agenda and endangerment rules will reach into every corner of our economy and lives. They might protect people against illusory threats from climate change, but they will definitely impose skyrocketing costs for energy and thus for everything we eat, make, drink, and do. For Americans, that translates into outsourcing and job losses, extensive harm to human health and welfare, especially for minority and other poor families. But for poor families in developing countries, it translates into lives that are unacceptably, unnecessarily, and unconscionably nasty, brutish, and short. This is not health and welfare and environmental justice for all. It's eco-imperialism, eco-colonialism, and even eco-manslaughter. It will not provide a lot of hope for people in the rest of the world or in this country. Thanks very much.